you bore the brunt of this. We also know you bore the brunt of it during the fires themselves. So we're here together. We're in this with you. Stay strong, and let's see what we can do to help as we move forward. So thank you, and thank you for being here tonight. And Judy Begay, Supervisor Begay, this is Supervisor Begay's district, and I know she has a few words as well. So Supervisor Begay.
I'm not sure if she was able to get on or not. Sean, was she able to get on?
Well, if I can, then I know that Supervisor Begay has been concerned and has been working diligently with the county staff to keep up on what is happening. And I'm sorry that she's having some problems. This rain has, she's up in coal mine, and I know this rain has probably affected her internet and her abilities to move forward here too. So just on her behalf, just again, thank you for your patience. Thank you for your resilience. And with that, Lucinda, I'm going to turn this over to you and your great staff. And I want to thank every single one of them as well for all of their time. They're giving up day and night to help our community. So again, thank you all. And thank you, Lucinda.
Thank you very much, Chair. Really appreciate your continuing support. And it's been a tough haul, and it's going to continue to be, unfortunately, through this monsoon season. So go ahead, Sean, to the next slide here. Just a little bit of history relative to the Schultz flooding impacts in Dhoni Park. As I think most of you are aware, Schultz did not affect the Pioneer Valley area to certainly, I don't recall any impacts. If they were fairly minor. Although further to the north in Sunset Crater Estates, there were significant impacts at that time. And fairly shortly after the initial flooding in 2010, I believe it was we constructed one berm between the end of Campbell Avenue and Landfill Road pretty much immediately. And then we built a second berm in 2012 and then also completed mitigation on 3 of the major watersheds on and off forest that contributed to that flow path and that came in again to Sunset Crater Estates. And that really had a tremendous impact. The initial berm and set of berms, smaller berms downstream of that larger berm, really had a positive impact. And throughout that entire area, in fact, throughout the entire Schultz flood area, once the mitigation was completed, since that time and until the pipeline fire, we only had one event where water flowed off the forest, and that was on 2018 when we had a 1,000-year rainfall event in the Brandis kind of Copeland, Peaceful, and particularly in Brandis Way corridor. And the mitigation performed exceptionally well given that volume of flood. Why we had 6 inches in an hour, so it was a tremendous amount of rain. But fortunately, none of the homes in that flood path and that were mitigated from Schultz had any interior flooding. So that worked, and it's worked in all the other areas too now until the pipeline fire. So we're now starting to see impacts downstream just because the volume is so great at this time. So next slide, Sean. Next, I want to just touch on the flood risk assessment that was done. We conduct, frankly, the first phone call that happens when we have a wildfire that affects steep slopes and areas where we have downstream neighborhoods. My first call is always to Jay Fuller to begin the modeling of the potential flood impacts. And that was, I think, my first or second call when we saw the fire had pipeline fire was underway. And certainly there was some impact from the tunnel fire on the northern watersheds on over in Timberline, but we expected very limited impacts there on the Copeland and Peaceful and Lenox watersheds. If you see the watersheds here, starting from the south to the north. But the pipeline fire was very different in that it burned the very upper slopes of those watersheds. And in particular, and unfortunately for your area, the watershed that's impacting the Dhoni Park area, including Pioneer Valley, is the government tank watershed. And as you can see there, the green line is the Schultz fire, and then the red line that goes up to the top of the peaks there and captures that, what is kind of an L-shaped watershed that government tank is. That whole upper reach there is the government tank. Yeah, go up on the mountain there, Sean. That is the Weatherford Canyon. Keep going all the way up to the red line there at the top. All of that area is the government tank watershed, and it's now that upper area that's contributing just a tremendous amount of volume of water into Dhoni Park. And what that has resulted in, go to the next slide there, Sean. What that's resulted in is this dramatic increase in the potential for flooding. The modeling reflects the underlying assumptions of a 2-inch rainfall in 45 minutes, which is a 25-year event, which has a 4% chance of occurring in any given year. That doesn't mean, frankly, even in a given day, you could have 2 25-year events, but you can see the data there. But really important is on that chart, the watershed discharge. You can see how much the increase of that volume of water that's coming off that watershed. Next slide, please. And what you're seeing here, which is really critical to understand, the water flow that is affecting Dhoni Park the most dramatically right now. If you look down at the bottom of this slide, you will see this is government tank coming in. It hits the neighborhood at Switchback and Heppel areas on the west side of Highway 89. And see where I point out Highway 89 there, Sean. And then it kind of splits and it crosses the highway in several locations, but particularly crosses the highway in those 2 locations. But the major flow is going to the south, crossing there near the APS solar plant that's there. And then that southern flow that's going to the right, I'll say, and to the south there into Dhoni Park, that flow never took place during Schultz. That flow never occurred. And that's because there was such a limited amount of government tank that was burned during Schultz. Now we have that upper reach. It's very steep, very severely burned, and we're getting just a tremendous amount of additional water that's coming through. You can also see that the watersheds, both the 2 paintbrushes, north and south paintbrush, as well as Campbell, also flows to that northern flow area. Although to date, we've had almost virtually no flow beyond the twin berms, and it is beginning to capture a fair amount of water behind those berms. And we're expanding one of the berms there now, is under construction to expand that, although frankly it's become very difficult because it's so saturated out there to get equipment in. And unfortunately, one of the other berms there is beginning to degrade. And that was a berm one of those berms was constructed fairly rapidly during the flooding in I believe it was 2010. So anyway, the goal is to reconstruct that berm this fall, and also construct berms both below, and I'll talk more about this later, both below Landfill Road, both on the northern flow path and on the southern flow path. And I'll come back to that later. Next slide, please. And then as it flows into Dhoni Park, you can see the flow path, that the southern flow that again did not occur during Schultz at Vista de Oro. That's the flood path that's coming in. Now you'll see at the modeling here that the modeling did not pick up flows into the into Pioneer Valley. What this modeling is based on LIDAR, which is a radar, a type of radar ground topography modeling system. They get up in a plane and they use this special form of radar, and it is fairly accurate at capturing and depicting what is on the ground in terms of topography. Unfortunately, when you get into more developed areas, it becomes more difficult because a lot of the drainage and modifications do not appear. But what we believe part of what is playing out, why this did not get picked up, is that since 2019, there has been a modification to drainages in this area, and therefore it wasn't there to be picked up. And then likely there's some impact that perhaps it didn't pick up of some of the drainage facilities within Pioneer, because sometimes that it doesn't pick that up. But it's very likely that was some form of change since 2019. So, and that's what resulted in not showing a large segment of that area in the original modeling. We're working to modify that now to more accurately reflect, but the reality is now we're in the flooding, and once we had that first flood on the 14th, we immediately remobilized the engineering effort to look at what was needed for mitigation. And I know Mark Lamer is going to talk a little bit more about that later. Importantly, though, further south in Dhoni Park is actually where we're getting also, or we will see, we haven't seen, I think to date it's flowed just about to Cowboy Way on the last larger event. But we're not seeing that ponding yet, but it's certainly predicted that we will. And we would expect that. Next slide, please. And this is just repeating what I shared, that the modeling did not pick up that. It did not identify the Pioneer Valley area at being at high risk for flooding. That modeling does not capture below a half foot of flooding. So you could have seen sheet flow in any of those areas at 6 inches or less. So, and that's why we were messaging, if you were in an area that didn't show any kind of, flooding within an area, that if your home's on grade, it's still really important that you place bags around any openings, doorways, garages, that type of thing. Next slide, please. The flood events to date, I think this outlines those flood events. Want to point out, what was actually seen in the gauges or in the gauge. There is one gauge in the government tank watershed. I'll come back to that in just a minute, what we're doing to change that. But this shows you what has occurred to date based on that modeling. Certainly, if you look at the National Weather Service radar for both the 14th and the 23rd event, as well as the 25th event, you will see that the rainfall was quite intense. But that was not being captured necessarily in the gauge. And the reason for that is that the gauge that's on government tank was installed after the Schultz fire. And because the Schultz fire, again, didn't burn that upper area, there was no gauge placed there. It was still, and it's also in a wilderness area, dedicated wilderness area. We had to go about getting special permission through the regional office, the U.S. Forest Service, to install a second gauge. And that gauge was installed today up in the burned area now. So we have a second gauge up in that. They're doing the technology work now to integrate that into the gauge system. And that's going to help tremendously to understand what is happening on that upper burn scar area. That's really, frankly, it's really creating the impacts that we're seeing in this flood corridor. So the 24th, this last Sunday, that was almost entirely localized rainfall, but very, very heavy. The Weather Service reported 2 to 3 inches in the Dhoni Park area. And that greater, I will say east, primarily east of the Highway 89, although some rainfall did fall within the Timberline neighborhood as well. And then the 25th, we had a very short, intense rainfall on the ridge. It was fortunately, it was very short. In fact, the people who installed the gauge were up there taking the equipment in to do the installation. And they literally called and said, there's a big wall of water coming down. Fortunately, the cell left very quickly, but there is a wall of water coming down. And then the 26th had some rainfall on the lower watershed, but again, that was mostly localized rainfall. We meant localized, meaning right in the Dhoni Park area. So next slide, please. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and Mark's with a local engineering consulting firm, and he and his associate Lizzie have been spending a tremendous amount of time out in your area and have developed all the recommended mitigation exhibits, which are now all online, and he's going to walk through that with you and a few other elements as well. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Lucinda. So we were, the firm I'm with, Remmel Consulting, we were one of the 3 firms that were assigned or asked to help put in the efforts to identify the homes that needed mitigation. And we did that through a paper assessment process where we looked at the maps that Lucinda showed earlier. And from those maps, we determined flow depths and flow velocities and determined what sort of mitigation was needed for those properties. From there, we developed those exhibits that were posted online, and then those exhibits showed sandbags or concrete barrier. Most everything down in Dhoni Park is sandbags, and they seem to be working pretty well in the low height flows. The initial assessment did include 553 homes down there in the Dhoni area. However, the south portion of Pioneer Valley, like Lucinda talked about, was not on that initial map assessment. So what happened on July 14 is we got that flow. You can go ahead to the next slide, Sean. We got that flow, and that flow came down. Talked about this at the July 14th meeting at Cromer. And in reviewing the flood and the impacts, and myself and Lizzie were out there trying to watch the flood and figure out where it was going and why. It was determined that it's really going to come into that more south portion of Pioneer Valley. And that's why we went out there on Saturday, July 16th, and some engineers with Remmel, myself and Lizzie, Peak Engineering, Burgess and Neipel, and Woodson Engineering. We visited 121 homes out there trying to get the word out that additional mitigation was needed. Low height sandbag mitigation was recommended. The new exhibits that were created, those are posted and they are available on the county website. So to check out these exhibits, go ahead and access that link right there that Sean's got up on the slide. The new exhibits do include the recommended mitigation for the south and more western portion of Pioneer Valley. So please make sure you check those out. You can go to the next slide. So the sandbags, most of the mitigation down in the Dhoni Park, the overwhelming amount of mitigation down in Dhoni Park is the sandbags. And we've learned over the years that these sandbags are very effective in the lower velocity and the shallower flows. And that's why we've specified for them to be out there. Approximately 400,000 sandbags have already been placed. We need upwards of $1 million to help out the entire affected area. So please use these sandbags as they're being placed out there. They're at the Peaks View Park and on Cokefield Road. They were at the school. They are being dropped into the neighborhoods intermittently. So please recognize the sandbags are there for everybody to use to mitigate their home against flooding. We do recommend that the sandbags be built in more of a pyramid fashion, which I got a slide a little bit later to show that. Really want to avoid stacking the sandbags upright on top of each other, as they can fall over when the flow comes into them. There's more information on stacking the sandbags and how they should be stacked. Again, it's the Coconino County website has all this information. So I suggest you go check that out and make sure you're stacking the bags per the recommended. Go to the next slide, Sean. So when you look at the exhibits, this is the typical kind of information you'll see. It'll identify, we tried to colorize it so it'll identify the type of mitigation that you need, how many bags high, or sorry, it's actually not how many bags high, it's a recommended height. And this is a very important consideration. The bags, in most of the bags in the Pioneer Valley area are the 1.5 foot, excuse me, height. So what's important is you get that height for your sandbag mitigation. And then when you look at the pyramid stack, which is in the lower kind of right side of the slide, you know, it's just like a set of bowling pins, and you want to make sure you're getting that more pyramid stack, and that helps. One, it helps stabilize the wall, so it's less likely to fall over. It also helps seal the bags on top of themselves, so it limits the amount of water that gets through the sandbag barriers. You can go to the next slide, Sean. Thank you very much. Something that we are seeing a lot of since the flows have started is what we've termed wildcat mitigation. And the wildcat mitigation is very prevalent down in Pioneer and Dhoni area. And the wildcat mitigation is when properties are being mitigated, not following the recommended mitigation methods identified by the county. And the problem with these is it creates upstream and downstream impacts. The water is getting pushed to other residents downstream. It's getting routed around a home by putting sandbags along a fence line or on a property line, or putting in sand berms, or putting in channels through your property. And what that does is it takes that water and it directs it to somebody else's house. What it also does is it creates an impoundment, especially down here in the Dhoni area where we don't have as much slope. It's a little bit flatter. It impounds the water a little bit, allows it to pile up before it can flow another direction. And so we get a little bit more height. And as Lucinda mentioned, a lot of these homes in these areas are slab on grade or don't have a whole lot of relief above the ground. So if you're adding any height, or if the height is being increased in the water due to this wildcat mitigation, it's going to start impacting both upstream and downstream users. So I mentioned sandbags on property lines rather than around the home. That's one of the forms of wildcat mitigation that we don't want to have happening. And then there's the bigger wildcat mitigation of building dirt berms and building channels that are routing the water. Just to be aware, property owners that put in wildcat mitigation, or they're mitigating along their property line and on their fence lines, they are liable for impacts that they're creating to adjoining parcels upstream and downstream. And it's also a violation of county code for water flow. Next slide, please, Sean. So some of you may be aware there were some concrete barriers, about 1,400 feet worth of concrete barriers placed near Landfill Road, in between Landfill Road and the Vista de Oro neighborhood, just to the northwest. And they were put in there as an emergency measure to slow the flow down, to slow the velocity down. They're helping reduce the velocity for sure. They're also helping reduce the debris that's making it downstream. We're cleaning out a lot of woody debris after every storm up there. These are not there. The volume of water coming off these flows is very significant. And so these are not there to necessarily mitigate the volume of the water that's coming. So they're having a limited benefit for the volume of water. There's a little bit there, but mostly it's to reduce the velocity coming through there, slow it down, and then also to get the debris to fall out. That particular area where the concrete barriers are currently is being looked at for putting in 2 berms, similar to the ones Lucinda talked about earlier. And we're working with the Forest Service and another engineering company here in town to try to get those berms built as soon as possible. Go to the next slide, Sean. So Lucinda mentioned some of these a little bit earlier. I just want to point out that there is some other long-term mitigation that is beneficial to the Dhoni Park area that was constructed as a result of the Schultz fire flooding flows. And then that mitigation has been repaired and is being maintained and addressed as part of these floods from the pipeline fire. So the Campbell Terminal Trench and rundowns over there off of Campbell, those drain the paintbrush watersheds, and they didn't burn, and they're doing okay, but they are having to be maintained for debris and rock now and sediment. Lucinda mentioned the twin berms that are getting expanded, getting built out. We got a local company working on that almost all day long, every day now. And then the Girls Ranch berm still there, and Copeland Channel, they're getting cleaned out and maintained after every storm event as well. And I believe next slide is for Christopher. Thank you.
Christopher?
Oh, I'm here, thank you.
Right.
Sorry about that. So I want to talk about the maintenance of the roads and the HOA detention facility, but maybe I'll start out by saying that I just want to recognize that this is an extraordinary situation, and that nobody deserves this, and nobody deserves to go through this. And like Mark and Lucinda talked about, that the county's going to be here, and we're going to do everything we can to lessen the impacts of this disaster and try to help everybody that we can. So Sean, let's go to the next slide. So the program for public works and the roads, in this particular case in Pioneer Valley, that the county public works road maintenance division is responsible to maintain those roads. However, the driveway culverts that are within county right of way are the responsibility of the individual property owner. We know of, there's that detention basin that's the responsibility of the homeowners association, and it's proved to help somewhat lessen the impacts of some of the flooding, but it's not nearly the size or can handle the volume that we're seeing. And you might know this, but Pioneer Valley was developed in the early 1990s, and with no real formal drainage plan, and certainly no drainage plan that could handle the type of post-wildfire flooding that we're experiencing. So Sean, you can go to the next slide, please. So we aim to clear roads as soon as we can after a flood event has happened. We'll scrape off the roads. We try to remove all the sediment and debris. We try to get all the roadside ditches open. We can't, given the nature of the flood events that we've had so far, that not a lot of repairs are taking place. And certainly on private roads, we're able to scrape them and remove the debris and make them open and passable. But those are private roads, and we're not able to spend highway user revenue funds or road maintenance sales tax funds repairing private roads. But we do want to maintain roadside ditches within county right of way, and we're trying to do that. And we're hiring outside contractors, and our own road maintenance crews are responding to this. And frankly, we're starving resources in other parts of the county to support this activity. But this is really the area that needs the most help, and so we're happy to do it. And those roadside ditches, like I said before, they were not designed to handle post wildfire flooding type flows. And frankly, and you probably witnessed it, that they're have little impact and a little positive impact in mitigating the flood waters that come across. Let's go to the next slide, please, Sean. So I'm going to turn it over to Lucinda to talk about long-term mitigation.
Great, thank you, Christopher. And I know we've gotten a lot of questions. Thanks for covering that information, because I know we've gotten a lot of questions out in the area there, in terms of the roadways and maintenance of the roadways. And I think one of the other points on that slide too was that there is within that Hutchinson, or excuse me, Pioneer Valley HOA area, there is that track A, which was created for open space and detention. And Sean, go ahead and put the slides back up there. But important that to know that that is the responsibility of the HOA to maintain that. And it probably be a good idea to get a contractor out there soon to get that cleaned out. So, but again, the county will be maintaining the roads and roadside ditches as we have resources. I know Joe Dirt's been out there quite a bit this last couple weeks, and we'll put resources there when we can. But again, unfortunately, the roadside ditches just can't convey very much and don't have too much impact overall. So long-term mitigation, and this is always the challenge with post-wildfire flooding, is that, go ahead and go to the next slide, Sean. The real challenge is that you're in this flood fight, and it's very consuming dealing with this, particularly because it's repetitive, and you're constantly trying to manage the needs of the short-term issues that arise, whatever those are, between maintaining roads and keeping them intact and all the flood measures and so forth. And I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize that Mark mentioned was all the pre-work that we had done, and then now the continuous work we're doing up on the forest to maintain the mitigation that was constructed post Schultz, and how that is crucial to how much water we're getting into Dhoni Park as well. And so continuously managing those mitigation measures, which frankly we haven't touched since constructed until now, but has been really important to continuing to reduce down the impacts throughout those flood corridors. So in terms of long-term mitigation, which is already, the planning and engineering is already underway, there are three elements to post-wildfire long-term flood mitigation. First and foremost, and the game changer, is what we can do up on the forest relative to watershed restoration measures. And when we say watershed restoration measures, there's kind of two actions or efforts that we can take that are really critical to, particularly to managing the volume of sediment and debris that comes into the neighborhoods, but also has shown historically, and again today, frankly, I'll give you a great example, how they can also influence the level of water that comes into the neighborhood. So one is restoring the natural alluvial fans that exist above the neighborhoods and in some of these corridors. Different amount of that alluvial fan in each corridor, but restoring those fans. So what's taking place up on those fans right now is we get these high volume, high velocity flood events, is that they are eroding through. Alluvial fan is a wide place in the river. It's an area where water will spread out, slow down, and drop out as sediment. If you look at any river, Colorado River, where it widens out, it slows down, and that's where you get beaches, right? Think of it that way. But on the forest, historically, there have been these alluvial fans, and pre-fire, they work very effectively in any kind of downpour that may have happened. Obviously, the amount of water was reduced dramatically by the intervention of the trees and the duff on the ground and healthy soil, right? But these fans are really crucial. And unfortunately now they are eroding. So instead of capturing sediment and debris, they are eroding through and they're sourcing sediment and rock into the neighborhoods, including the government tank, watershed below, the neighborhoods below, including into Dhoni Park. And so part of the plan will be to secure, the approvals and secure the funding to be able to go up onto the forest and restore those fans so that they can function as they would naturally. Now, if we did not go up there and do that, they would restore themselves, but it might take 50, 100, 150 years before that occurs. So we're advancing that natural restoration process. That's why we call it watershed restoration. And this has been very successful in Schultz. And then again, today we saw the success in the museum burn scar area, which got an inch of rainfall in 1 minute, in 15 seconds today, or 15 minutes, sorry. 1 inch of rainfall in 15 minutes. And there was very little water that entered the city of Flagstaff. And so, and the impacts that we're seeing in that area have dropped dramatically. Now, in any given watershed, things can be different. The volume of water is different. There's a lot of things complicating that factor. And it won't necessarily have that impact in this corridor or any other corridor. But it's certainly to date, these measures have had significant positive impacts. We'll also construct what we call grade control or erosion control measures in narrower channels, again, to reduce down the sourcing of sediment. Because if you don't reduce down the sourcing of sediment by these types of efforts, measures, then you can't construct mitigation downstream because it just fills up with sediment. And the capacity of that mitigation, channels, storm drains, inlets, detention facilities, they just fill up with sediment and they aren't going to produce any flood mitigation. So this is crucial. This is crucial to the second item here, flood mitigation within the neighborhoods. And that will consist of channels and detention facilities. Then the third element is increasing the drainage infrastructure capacity at Highway 89 and likely installing both upstream and downstream detention facilities in that area of the highway. That's particularly the case here in the government tank area, is that because once you get off the mountain and you get down into the flatter areas, particularly within Dhoni Park, we get a lot of ponding. So we've got to be able to convey the water somewhere and then hold that water so it doesn't end up ponding in the neighborhoods. That would be the goal. Very important to understand, all of these measures will only operate within a certain level of rainfall event. They aren't going to mitigate every rainfall event. That is not possible to create. That take hundreds of millions of dollars. So, but it will mitigate more frequent, repetitive storms, smaller storms, up to sometimes moderate storms, storm events. Again, the factors that will influence that are the intensity of the rainfall, the extent of the rainfall over the watershed as well influences that, and as well as drainage potentially coming in from other areas. If you have localized rain and you also have rain on the mountain, that type of thing. So again, we're looking at all of these elements, and there are engineering teams that are looking at each of these elements and putting together conceptual plans. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're developing these conceptual level mitigation plans. It's very similar to, and the flood control district, we've already began discussions with the process with Natural Resources Conservation Service. We've already provided the formal notification that we will be applying for long-term emergency watershed protection program funding. That's what it's called, EWPP. You'll hear a lot about that over the next couple of years. And they were here last Tuesday and visited some of the area, including the Dhoni Park area. And they are working very cooperatively with us, and we will be submitting an application. I'll come back to that soon, or in just a minute here, for at least some of the corridors to begin work with immediately. We're also in communication with the Forest Service, and then for those on-forest measures. And then relative to the department, relative to the impacts to the highways and that infrastructure, we're already been in contact with the Federal Department of Transportation, as well as, of course, ADOT for funding support. And that support really is tied to how much impact is there to their maintenance costs and repair costs. And we have to hit a certain threshold. If we hit that threshold, then we become eligible for emergency relief funds through Federal Department of Transportation. So, we're, ADOT, of course, is tracking those costs, monitoring those costs. We're submitting those costs as well that we're incurring, because we're assisting with clearing the highway as well. So, want to talk a little about specifically the government tank watershed and that flood corridor. This will be, bar none, the most complicated post-wildfire engineering effort ever undertaken, certainly in this county and likely anywhere within the Western United States. This is an extremely complicated situation. Fortunately, the on-forest conditions, meaning that there are alluvial fans to actually go up and restore, that's a real positive. And so those plans are underway, and I think we feel pretty confident that they can have a positive impact downstream. The mitigation that will be needed to be undertaken within, starting at where it hits the neighborhoods there at Switchback and Heppel, all the way through Dhoni Park, is going to be extremely complex. Because through this process, we have to also make sure that we do not create either upstream or downstream adverse impacts. And so at every step of the engineering, we conduct analysis called no adverse impact analysis. And we have to validate at each step that we are not creating impacts, adverse impacts, and as a result of that, the mitigation measures, the channels, the detention facilities, all have to stay within the flood paths that are in the neighborhoods now. Because if we were to move those flood paths out of that area and into another, 3 or 4 blocks over, and we had additional flooding there, that would be an adverse impact, for example. So we have to, engineering on this is going to be extremely difficult. We've also got a very compact area to construct mitigation in. It's much more, I'll say, semi-urbanized in the Dhoni Park area. That creates a lot more challenge. Where do you put channels? Do you use channels or storm drain? And only certain measures are eligible under the Natural Resources Conservation Service funding. And so we've got to stay within the funding parameters, assuming we're approved for funding. That we don't know that yet. We have to apply. They have to review it, make a determination, and will only be funded for certain types of measures. And so it's a very complex process, but this is a very complex engineering challenge. And so this is going to take a considerable amount of time. The other complexity to this is that because government tank was not impacted very much from the Schultz fire, and therefore there was very limited funding, we didn't pursue mitigation, long-term mitigation in that corridor. We focused on the corridors that had the major impacts and had impacts. And as a result of that, the areas that we need to go on the forest, and also all the area through the neighborhoods, has to go through a National Environmental Policy Act review. They have to identify, are there cultural resources in the area? Are there wildlife or other impacts that would take place as the mitigation? We have to go through a very formal legal process. The Forest Service as well as NRCS, they lead that process. And they have to go through a very formal process to determine whether or not there are negative impacts to the environment by constructing these measures. And so, they are getting prepared to conduct those efforts, but that is a major effort. If you look at what occurred after the Schultz fire, and then we went into the flooding, and we began to plan for the long term. From 2010, when the fire occurred, we constructed our first measures in spring of 2013. So it was almost 3 years. In this case, I think it could be very similar. We're probably looking at 2 to 3 years by the time we can complete the engineering, get all the approvals in place, get the contract, get all the processes that have to be put in place. But I can tell you, and they can attest to this, I am pushing everybody really hard, because my goal and our goal is to get this done in 2 years. That's the goal. Don't know if we can make that. There's lots of different factors that can influence this. We find significant number of archaeological sites on forest that will potentially impact what we can do. If there are other issues that surface that could impact that timeline. Weather impacts that timeline. As everyone's aware, we have 2 relatively short construction seasons in this area. Typically, all these measures will be constructed in spring. We're going to try to do some construction in fall. Frankly, that became very challenging with Schultz. So, we've got a phenomenal team. They've all been through this before with Schultz and with museum. And I think we've put together the team that can deliver this. But unfortunately, it's not going to happen overnight. And it very unlikely it will happen before the next monsoon season. Got to be honest with you. I'm not going to not be honest with you. I have to be honest with you. It's important that you understand what is transpiring and how hard we're working. People, and including myself, we're working 18-hour+ days to try to make this all happen. So where we are with government tank is, because of the flood events, NRCS is working very closely with us. Again, we're here Tuesday. They got to witness this flooding, which has been very important. And they're working very closely with us. Within the next 2 months, we will be submitting to NRCS the conceptual plan for the government tank measures on private property. NRCS only funds measures on private property or in public infrastructure. So in public right of way, we don't fund anything on forest. We're seeking funding from the Forest Service for on forest measures. So we'll be submitting that application to them, conceptual level, and then working through that step by step with them. And they'll make a determination, how much again are they going to fund, what measures are eligible, what they are. May have to go back and tinker with that and go through a process depending upon what the response is, because they have certain requirements they have to meet by federal regulation. So I want to say that also know that our congressional delegation, Congressman O'Halloran, Congressman Stanton, who's out of Phoenix, doesn't even represent this area, Senator Kelly, Senator Sinema, have been with us from day one. They are strongly supporting this effort. They're strongly advocating and communicating with the agencies that they need to step up and support what we need. And so every angle they're working with us, and they're crucial to this whole effort. And they have been, and they're continuing to be a real strong support for what we need in this area to move forward with not only the short-term efforts, but the long-term. We also did secure from Natural Resources Conservation Service significant funding, about $2.2 million, towards both the sandbags and barriers. So it's called exigency. It's for emergency measures, and it only covers that effort: sandbag production, deployment, as well as barrier purchase, and it covers only 75% of those costs. And again, some of the costs that contribute to that are included and some are not. But so again, so far we're getting tremendous support from the federal agencies, but we'll continue to have to advocate for that as we move forward. So next slide, John. So communications, how can you communicate with us, and how are we communicating with you? Next slide. So first and foremost, the number one communication is relative to life safety. And the most important thing is making sure you're signed up for the county emergency alert system, the emergency notification system, and make sure you've gone in and signed up. Sign up. You can sign up for as many devices as that you want: cell phones, landlines, computers, laptops, iPads, sign up all your devices so that you're getting those alerts, so that you know when the funding is coming. And certainly make sure at all times you know where your children and pets are. And this is a shelter in place. If you get that notification through text or email or phone call, make sure that you're sheltering in place. Go into your home, remain in your home. So just a sec. Somebody's trying to deliver me dinner. So that's the most important communication in all of this, because your life and your safety is the paramount issue given flash flooding. Next slide, please. This again, just reminding you of the alert system. Also, National Weather Service flood warnings, you can sign up for those as well. Again, to remind people, if you live in Pioneer Village and you sign up for the county emergency alert system, then you will go ahead and you'll, irrespective of where you are, if there's flooding into Dhoni Park, you will get that notification. You could be in Phoenix, you could be in California, you could be anywhere, and you're going to get that notification. But if you aren't in that area that is impacted by the flooding, you will not get that. So if you don't live in those neighborhoods that are impacted by the flooding, you will not get that alert unless you happen to be out in that area and you have a cell phone. Then it comes through another emergency alert system called IPAWS. And it basically tags and alerts every cell phone in that pyramid, in that polygon area. Thank you. In that polygon area. So there are two different systems working. One is for people who may just be in that area. Maybe they're hiking, maybe they're visiting someone, maybe at a commercial establishment, that type of thing. So again, make sure to sign up for the county alert system. Next slide, please. And here are various things that are important. You should have received your flood preparation guide. I believe they've been sent out. We've got a whole series of something we've been producing and those going out. Again, the emergency notifications, there's the link to that. National Flood Insurance Program. Of course, we strongly encourage everyone to sign up for flood insurance. That is the only mechanism to recover any cost impacts to your home. People say, well, when will FEMA? I've had probably 3 times people ask me, when will FEMA arrive? FEMA doesn't arrive. There is no money coming from FEMA. All through Schultz, we never qualified for individual assistance, which is assistance that would assist an individual homeowner through the FEMA, not through the National Flood Insurance. People did get claims filled and claims, were submitted. And those were filled, they did get funding back through that mechanism, but just from FEMA, no, the threshold you have to meet to qualify for individual assistance is very, very high. Think Katrina, think massive, hurricane, that type of thing. And even if you do, that's capped at $32,500. So flood insurance covers up to $250,000. Again, may not be the entire value of your home. But it's as we say, it's better than nothing. So then we've got other information here. Most importantly, if you have questions after the set of slides, I'll be finishing up here in just a moment. Please email us at pipelinefirefloodarea@coconino.az.gov. It's right there. Sean, show them where the email is. The best way to communicate with us is through the email. Strongly encourage you also to be frequently consulting the website. And if you put in Schultz pipeline flood area, it will come right up, hit the link, and you'll go into that website. Tremendous amount of information on it. Importantly, there is a frequently asked questions piece on there that's been developed. And every time we get a new type of question that comes in, we update that and it goes back onto the website. So continue to frequently look at that. If there are changes in flood paths and we're recommending new mitigation measures, we go in and update those exhibits. And again, like we have done for your area already, and are doing for other areas as well. In the left-hand corner here, there's the Flagstaff burn scar flood risk system that the National Weather Service has put together for our burn scars. And that gives a 3-day outlook. And then as well as the rain gauge data. Back to the rain gauges. So I did mention that we are adding a second gauge in the government tank area up on that severely burned section on the steep slope. So that's going to provide some additional important information to us. We're also adding one into the Schultz Creek watershed wilderness area, as well as Lennox Wupaki trails, another gauge there as well. So, and you can monitor those gauges from that web link there as well. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Again, if you have questions for us, I think we tried to cover, we went back through and looked at all the questions that have come in from Pioneer Valley, other than ones that might be specific to a specific property. And we've tried to answer the questions. Again, we're trying to do the best we can. And again, but if you have additional questions, please email us. Also, I want you to know if you have requested assistance with placing sandbags, if you're elderly or disabled, we've been checking back in with people to find out if they still need assistance. Many people have gone, neighbors have helped and others have helped. We really are grateful for that. We have not been able to secure, well, been able to secure very, very limited resources to support placing bags. We do have a team. Team Rubicon is here for the next week. And the goal is for those that are remaining on that list that have not been able to secure support through family, friends, neighbors, church groups, that we will get out hopefully within the next week or so and get all of those caught up and get those done. So our priority will be to get those completed. We've been trying to go through that list, but have had very, very limited resources. In terms of sandbags, we're approaching 540,000 sandbags that have been produced. And we've brought on now 100 inmates at the Kingman prison that are producing sandbags as well. And those will begin being transported later this week into Dhoni Park. We've had to move, of course, with school starting and the needs of the school district. We've moved the stockpile of sandbags now to the Peaks View Park, County Park. They're on Copefield Road, so go there for bags, or at the corner of Campbell and Highway 89. We're stockpiling pre-filled bags there. We will be, over the next week, moving, we will be taking bags directly from where they're being produced to the homes that are for the elderly and disabled. Again, with that Team Rubicon group here, doing that sandbagging. So, you know, the production is basically staying the same, but we are going to divert, I'll say, or move bags into those specific homes so that we can get those homes mitigated. So, but we'll be monitoring that and trying to keep both of the stations stocked with pre-filled bags. Of course, the self-fill stations are all in operation still as well, of course. So with that, I really want to thank all of our presenters. I want to thank you for your patience. I know how stressful this is. And I also want to point out that on the webpage, there are information there about resources available to support you with other types of needs. Mental health needs, health and human services needs. So if you have other types of needs, certainly look at the website. And again, feel free to email us and say, hey, I need help with some other type of need. This is very stressful, and it's very difficult on people and their overall well-being, their mental well-being. And I went through Schultz. And we're very, all very aware of that. And we just ask you to take a deep breath and hang in there with us. We're with you through this the whole way. And we're going to fight for every resource we can. Again, working hand in hand with our congressional delegation to get what we need to do what we need to do. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.